At dawn in the Strait of Hormuz, a Chinese-linked tanker kept moving. On the bridge of the American ships enforcing the new blockade, its track line was visible in real time. The vessel did not drift, it did not slow down, it did not ask for permission. It held its course through one of the most militarized strips of water on Earth, as if the line Washington had just drawn in public did not exist. That image matters more than all the speeches that came before it, because the real story is not that one tanker crossed the Strait of Hormuz. The real story is that the United States announced a blockade to the world and then discovered in full public view that a blockade declared against Iran is not the same thing as a blockade America is willing to enforce against China. That is the moment people should sit with, not the headline, not the posturing, not the usual television language about resolve and deterrence. The moment a sanctioned Chinese-linked tanker moving through the most important energy choke point on Earth and the strongest navy in the world choosing not to turn that moment into a direct confrontation. That is not a small detail inside the story. That is the story. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been treated as a symbol of American command. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that narrow corridor. If Washington wanted the world to believe it could control escalation there, most capitals believed it. That belief itself was part of American power. The announcement of enforcement carried weight because the world assumed the United States would accept the cost of making its words real. This week, that assumption was tested. Donald Trump announced a naval blockade of Iranian exports with the familiar confidence that public declaration and actual power are the same thing. The message was simple. No vessel would pass. No tanker would leave. The line was drawn. The warning was issued. The world was supposed to understand that the matter was settled, and then the tanker moved. Tracking data showed it. Reporting confirmed it. The crossing entered the public record. And the most important part of the sequence was not what China said. It was what America did not do. Nothing. Now, before anyone turns this into a cheap slogan, let me be precise. This was not a military defeat in the cinematic sense. No missiles were fired. No ships exchanged blows. No American vessel was sunk. No Chinese warship rammed a blockade line. What happened was more dangerous than that because it was quieter than that. A credibility line was tested, and Washington decided the price of enforcing its own line was too high. Once you understand that, everything else comes into focus. The Strait of Hormuz is not just geography. It is a pressure chamber where oil, shipping, diplomacy, military posture, alliance credibility, and global market psychology all meet in a space barely wide enough for error. Whoever can shape behavior there without triggering total war holds leverage far beyond the water itself. Iran understood that, and what Iran did was far more sophisticated than the cartoon version usually offered in Western commentary. Instead of closing Hormuz to everyone and turning the entire world against itself, Iran chose a selective structure. The waterway was not closed in the absolute sense. It was filtered, open for some, closed for others. China could move, Russia could move, India could move, Pakistan could move, America and Israel and the states most tightly aligned with them face restriction. That is a very different strategy from indiscriminate chaos. It is maritime politics done with a scalpel instead of a hammer. Iran was not simply threatening the global economy. It was using access itself as a geopolitical sorting mechanism. It was saying, in effect, that passage through one of the world's most critical choke points would now reflect political alignment that move matters, because it changed the question facing Washington. The question was no longer whether America could punish Iran. The question became whether America was ready to punish China for refusing to accept an American line drawn around Iranian trade. Those are not the same question. They do not carry the same risks. They do not produce the same calculations inside the Pentagon, inside the White House, or inside every foreign ministry watching from a distance. And China knew that what Beijing offered in response was not theatrical defiance. That is what makes it more significant. China did not need a dramatic threat. It did not need a grand speech. It did not need to manufacture noise. It stated calmly that its vessels would continue to transit under agreements already made. It signaled that it considered interference in those movements unacceptable. Then it let the movement itself make the argument. That is what confident power looks like. The insecure side usually raises its voice. The side that believes it understands the structure usually lowers its voice and lets the structure speak for it. That is what happened here. China was not only sending a tanker, it was sending a proposition to the entire world. The proposition was this: American declarations are real only up to the point where they collide with the costs of enforcing them against another major power. That proposition did not have to be spoken aloud because the crossing itself spoke it. And once that proposition becomes visible, the consequences do not stay in Hormuz. Every ally notices, every rival notices, every energy market notices, every government dependent on shipping lanes notices, because credibility in great power competition is not built out of rhetoric. It is built out of demonstrated willingness to accept cost. The line that matters is never the line you announce. The line that matters is the line you are prepared to enforce when the other side refuses to stop. This is why the event matters so much more than one tanker and one morning. It exposed the difference between announced power and enforceable power. That gap is the deepest strategic theme in the entire story. For years, Washington has relied on a certain political habit: declare strength loudly, assume the declaration itself changes the reality on the ground, and trust that the other side will either retreat or blink before the moment of decision arrives. Sometimes that works against weaker actors. Sometimes it even works against allies who still depend on American systems and fear direct rupture. But it is an entirely different game when the other side is China. China is not a failed state. China is not a regional actor with no economic leverage over the United States. China is an industrial power with deep supply chain leverage, expanding maritime capacity, enormous energy needs, and enough strategic patience to wait for America to create its own credibility problem. And that is exactly what happened. The public line was drawn too high. The enforcement appetite was lower than the public claim. China stepped into that gap once again. The real story is not the movement of the tanker itself. It is the architecture around it. China spent years building leverage in domains that do not look dramatic on television but matter. When confrontation arrives, it built industrial control over rare earth processing and key material chains. It built relationships across the Gulf, across Africa, across shipping routes that feed its energy security. It deepened its structural connection to Iranian exports because access to that energy is not a side issue for Beijing. It is part of the operating logic of the Chinese economy. When Washington threatened to choke Iranian exports, it was not only threatening Tehran's revenue, it was threatening an energy arrangement that serves Chinese interests. Beijing understood that immediately, and it responded in the calm language of a state protecting a supply line it considers strategically relevant. This is why the old unipolar reflex is becoming so dangerous. There was a time when the United States could assume that the announcement of a maritime restriction in a critical waterway would be taken by default as operational reality. That was part of what American naval primacy meant, not simply hardware, not simply tonnage. The deeper asset was presumption. The world presumed that if Washington said a line existed, then crossing it would be too dangerous. But history changes gradually, and then all at once. The gradual part happened over years. China expanded its navy. China built economic leverage. China cultivated regional ties. China became indispensable in supply chains that American power itself depends upon. China grew into a state whose interests can no longer be pressured casually without triggering calculations much larger than the original dispute. The sudden part is what people remember. A tanker crosses, nothing happens. The camera does not move on, but history does. That is the kind of moment this was, and Iran understood the value of it better than most commentators did. Iran's broader move in Hormuz was not irrational. It was structured by allowing some states through and blocking others. Tehran avoided the dumbest version of escalation. It did not turn every importing nation into an enemy at once. It preserved room for selected relationships. It made itself look less like a vandal and more like a state using geographic position as negotiated leverage. That distinction matters. It allowed Iran to say implicitly that it was not trying to burn the global system down. It was trying to reorder access according to political alignment. Whether one likes that position is a different matter. Strategically, it is coherent. And coherence is what makes it dangerous. Because once Iran behaves coherently and China behaves deliberately, the burden of incoherence falls on Washington. Now, the United States faces a path tree, and every branch is costly. If America enforces the blockade against Chinese-linked shipping, it risks a direct confrontation with a nuclear power over a narrow maritime theater where escalation could outrun intent in hours. If America does not enforce the blockade against Chinese-linked shipping, it teaches the world that its most dramatic declarations contain carve-outs defined not by law, but by fear of larger consequences. If America escalates economically to compensate for weak enforcement, it moves into a domain where China also holds retaliatory leverage through industry, minerals, manufacturing chains, and wider trade pressure. If America backs away rhetorically, it weakens the very deterrent language on which it has relied for years. Every road is expensive. That is what a real strategic trap looks like, not a single clash. A structure in which all available responses consume credibility, leverage, or stability. That is why this event should not be treated as a passing embarrassment. It is a map of the next phase. The larger geopolitical shift underneath it is not hard to see. The world that followed the Cold War trained Washington into certain habits. In that world, American naval presence often settled the argument before the argument had fully formed. It was enough to arrive, it was enough to announce, it was enough to imply that the cost of resistance would be too high for any rational actor. That world is fading. What replaces it is not a neat alternative order. It is a more contested one, more layered, more dangerous, precisely because several powers now possess enough leverage to block one another's preferred outcomes without yet possessing a stable framework for managing that competition cleanly. Transitions between orders are never comfortable. They become especially dangerous when the old dominant power continues speaking in the grammar of automatic command, while the real distribution of cost and leverage has already changed underneath it. That is why I keep returning to the scene in the water, not because it was spectacular, because it was revealing a Chinese-linked tanker moved through Hormuz. America had already told the world that the route would not be open. The movement was visible, the enforcement did not come. In one quiet sequence, the world saw that a public American line had encountered a real Chinese interest and stopped short of collision. No press release can fully erase that. No television segment can explain it away for the governments now adjusting their own calculations. Allies read moments like this carefully because alliance confidence depends on separating bold language from actual capacity, and rivals read moments like this even more carefully because they are looking for thresholds, for hesitation points, for proof that American risk tolerance is narrower than American rhetoric. Markets read them too, though in their own language, not morality, not prestige, probability, cost exposure, premium. The question for markets is not who won the argument on television. The question is whether the waterway is governed by a clear enforcement logic or by a fluid competition between several powers, all trying to avoid the one move that turns a crisis into a war. That kind of uncertainty does not stay local, it prices itself into the world. There's also a deeper lesson here about the way power works. Now, power in the 21st century is rarely the thing shouting the loudest. It is the thing that has patiently accumulated enough leverage across enough domains that when the test comes, it does not need to shout, it only needs to move. China has been building that kind of leverage for years, not just with ships, with industry, with energy relationships, with supply dependence, with quiet agreements, with an ability to endure economic friction longer than Washington often assumes. That patient accumulation is why a tanker crossing a contested line now says more about the global balance than 10 grand speeches. The United States still has enormous advantages that should be said plainly. It remains militarily powerful beyond comparison in many theaters. It still has a network of alliances that no rival can easily duplicate. It still has technological depth, capital power, and a capacity for renewal that should never be dismissed. But advantages are not self-executing. They do not transform themselves into outcomes. They require strategic discipline, coherence between word and action, and an honest internal ability to recognize when the world has changed. That last part is the hardest. Great powers rarely fail because they lose the ability to speak grandly about themselves. They fail because they continue speaking grandly after the structure has shifted and before their policy has caught up. That is why the most important question raised by Hormuz is not whether one tanker got through. The most important question is whether Washington can still look at a moment like this without lying to itself. Can it admit that there is now a gap between declaration and enforcement? Can it accept that China is no longer a peripheral variable in Middle Eastern pressure campaigns, but one of the central structural facts? Can it understand that an adversary does not need to defeat America militarily to blunt America strategically? Those are the questions that matter after the tanker has passed, because history rarely announces the end of an era with a trumpet. More often, it arrives as a visible inconsistency, a line declared, a line tested, a line not enforced, and then the watching world quietly revises its understanding of what is possible. That revision is already underway. Governments are recording it, military planners are recording it, energy strategists are recording it, foreign ministries are recording it. They are not asking whether America still has ships. Of course it does. They are asking something more serious. When American words meet Chinese interests in a narrow corridor of real risk, which one yields? This week, the answer was not theoretical. It was recorded in daylight on open water. And that answer will travel far beyond Hormuz. It will travel into every future sanction threat, every maritime warning, every alliance reassurance, every confrontation where Washington relies on declared pressure to shape the behavior of states that now believe American enforcement has a visible ceiling. That is why this moment matters. It is not the humiliation that matters most. It is a great power can survive a setback. What it cannot survive for long is the habit of pretending the setback did not reveal anything real. The Strait of Hormuz revealed something real. Iran showed that access can be turned into selective leverage. China showed that calm movement can be more powerful than loud defiance. And America showed that there are now lines it is willing to announce in public, but not willing to enforce once the cost becomes strategically serious. That is the new fact. The old era does not end because someone gives a speech declaring it over. It ends when the world stops believing that the old language still governs reality. This week, in 21 miles of water, a great many governments saw that belief weaken. And when belief weakens, order changes. The most dangerous thing for Washington now would be to misread this as a simple optics problem. It is not an optics problem. It is a structure problem. The structure is changing faster than the slogans. And when a superpower's slogans outrun its willingness to bear the price behind them, the slogans stop sounding like deterrence. They start sounding like memory. That is the sentence I would leave with. Not because it is dramatic, because it is the hard truth underneath the whole episode. In Hormuz, the United States did not lose a war. It lost something more precious than one tactical encounter. It lost the automatic presumption that its public line is the same thing as reality. Once that presumption cracks, the world begins to test everything else.